Tonight we begin our study now in Daniel chapter 2. And so I would invite you to turn, if you would, to Daniel chapter 2. While Daniel chapter 1 ends with a bit of reprieve and success and commendation for Daniel and his friends, Daniel chapter 2 begins with a rather interesting start, but it really kicks off with what I would call a dire, dangerous situation for Daniel and his friends. One where their lives are going to really hang in the balance. It is going to all revolve around, Daniel 2 that is, all revolves around a dream King Nebuchadnezzar had one night. And I'm not sure if you've ever read this chapter, if you've ever heard of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but you do have my outline before you, and you might want to understand that this is a rather ambitious chapter. It has everything to do with Daniel's life, but as also it has to do with thousands of years of world history that came after it, both in the near term and in the yet future. There's still a piece of this dream of Nebuchadnezzar's that hasn't been fulfilled yet, in my opinion. And I say that to tell you that I don't think we're going to get through my entire outline tonight. I want to tell you all everything about it. I want to go through this chapter in its entirety, but I do understand that time is a finite thing. And for that reason, I'm hoping to get up to verse 17. I want to talk to you about a strange dream, a serious demand, and a supernatural deliverance, though we'll probably get to that deliverance next week. But we begin here with what's going on in chapter 2. I want to begin with somewhat of a rhetorical question. It is dealing with dreams. I want to ask you, because I think now is an appropriate time, if you think God still communicates with people in dreams. Does God speak to people today in dreams? I think He can, and I'm not going to say He doesn't, but I am going to say it is a rather finicky thing, because I've had people all over the world, Christians and worldly people alike, I say all over the world, all over my life, where they say they have done something or they didn't do something because of a dream. Why, I read of a woman who was involved in a rape case. She was sexually assaulted, and the man that she fingered for the crime, the man that she testified against and sent to prison for 20 years, was chosen because she saw his face supposedly in a dream. And she swore in court that was him. She saw him in a dream. Sad thing is, many years later, something like 2 decades later, it was determined that he was actually innocent. He had done 20 years in prison based off of this woman's dream. I say that to you because many people these days are very quick to say they're doing something because God said it to them in a dream. Be wary of that, because not all dreams come from God. Some of us have had some very interesting dreams. And some of us, especially those of us who are married, can have interesting conversations with our dreams. I once heard of a husband who loved golf, and his wife loved to watch auctions. And one night when he was in his sleep, he yelled, 4! And in her sleep, she said, 425. I don't know if that's true. But really, people do all kinds of crazy things with dreams. But understand, not all dreams are from God. Although, as you're going to see in this chapter, God can speak to people in dreams and has spoken to people in dreams. It's not just the book of Daniel. Do you remember the Magi? When Jesus was born, an angel visited them in a dream and told them not to go back to Herod. Another angel appeared to Jesus' earthly father, Joseph, in a dream. So God can and did communicate in dreams. But I want to highlight for you a passage nowhere near Daniel, really. I'd put it down in your margin. It's Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah 23 unequivocally proves that not every dream is from God. In Jeremiah's day, there was a lot of false prophets, just like ours. And Jeremiah 23, verse 25 says this, concerning dreams, God speaking through the prophet says, I have heard what the prophets have said who prophesy lies in my name, saying, I have dreamed. I have dreamed. How long shall there be lies in the heart of the prophets who prophesy lies and who prophesy the deceit of their heart, who think to make my people forget my name by their dreams that they tell one another? And you go home and read the rest of Jeremiah chapter 23. God is rebuking and condemning those false prophets. He tells Jeremiah, is my word not like fire? Is it not like a hammer that breaks a rock? And yet these guys are telling my people the wrong things because they had a dream. He said, I didn't send them that dream. And that stands for me to tell you that not every dream comes from God. Something to keep in mind. But now to Daniel, now to our key text. That was just lagniappe for you, just a freebie, because people talk a lot about this kind of stuff. People have dreams all the time. Some of us have dreams almost every night, and by the time we get our cup of coffee in that morning, we forget. I don't know about you. You heard about the guy who dreamed he ate a giant marshmallow? And he told his buddy about it. I dreamed I ate a giant marshmallow. He said, well, that's interesting. He said, yeah, but the real crazy thing was when I woke up, my pillow was gone. I don't know if that was true or not. Probably just a dad joke waiting to happen. I'm sorry I did that to you. But in Daniel chapter 2, again, we're zeroing in on this weird dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And I gave you a picture of it on my handout sheet. But as we get to it, as I said, I want to go through those three things, probably the first two this evening. See, firstly, a strange dream. Look, if you would, at Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to read the first 9 verses to you. It says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. The king then commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. It should be known here that from here until chapter 7's conclusion, the rest of this next bit of the book of Daniel, from chapter 2, verse 4, up to chapter 7, verse 28, it's in Aramaic. And most people understand that because it focuses heavily on Gentiles. We get to chapter 8, it's going to go back to Hebrew. In our English Bibles, you don't see that. But this right here is in Aramaic. Daniel did that for a reason. More on that later. In verse 5, the king says, or rather in verse 4, the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic again, O king, live forever. They say, tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. Here's the weird thing. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So you understand, he had a weird, wacky dream. He calls his advisors. He said, I had a dream. I want to know what it means. They said, tell us what the dream is. He said, no. I want you to tell me what the dream was, then tell me what it means. And if you can't do that, you're going to die. And everybody in your family is going to suffer. In verse 7, they answered a second time. They said, no. Let the king tell his servants, and we will show what it means. The king said again, I know in verse 8 with certainty that you are trying to gain time. You're stalling because you see that the word for me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. This is interesting. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, tells his subordinates and his employees to come into the office. He says, tell me what my dream was, and if you can't do it, you're going to die. How'd you like to have a boss like that? Whew. But what he is showing us here in this passage is that what William Shakespeare said is true. Shakespeare once said, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. Nebuchadnezzar is stressed. He is in trouble. And I think he illustrates in this passage how much burden world leaders really carry. I want to show something to y'all. I meant to print these pictures out and I didn't have time. But I'm going to walk around and show you on my iPad, and I'm going to show you on the screen. This is pictures of two American presidents when they took office and when they left. The first one is Barack Obama. I'm going to step away for a second. So the picture on the left is what he looked like in 2009. The picture on the right is what he looked like in 2016 when he left office. Now, not all of us voted for Barack Obama. That's fine. But I think it is something worthy of note to say that there is a notable difference in these two pictures. It's 8 years apart. In the first one, in 2009, he's a young, one-term senator from Illinois. In the second one, his hair is grayed, his skin is wrinkled, his brow is furrowed, and it's the same thing that happened to his predecessor. This one here is George W. Bush, 2000, 2008. In just 8 years, these guys aged a lot because the kind of stress that I think is put on somebody who does that kind of job is not something you and I can perfectly understand, if even begin to understand, whether we voted for him or not. I think it's an interesting fact that when you look at a president, when he takes office, depending on how long he holds that position, he might look very, very different when he leaves office. Again, if I can get this to focus. 2000, 2009 with George Bush, and for those who would want to watch this later, this is Barry Obama. 2009 when he took office, and then 2016 right before he left office. Of course, he left to President Trump. Y'all, Nebuchadnezzar probably was in a similar stressful-like environment. This guy is king of the greatest empire the world had ever seen at that point. He wakes up in a cold sweat. His sleep has left him. He is embodying the words of King Solomon. Solomon, who knew a thing or two about being a world leader. Solomon, great king of Israel. Solomon said in the book of the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, "Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, who whether he eats little or much. But the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep." Nebuchadnezzar is struggling. He was in a serious pickle. But again, I submit to you, this dream came from God. God sent this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe he was looking towards the future with a little bit of anxiety. He was stressing over what would happen to his kingdom. Because his dream, this dream that we're about to read about, his dream dealt with many, many years of future historic events. Things that had not even began to happen yet. And I think he probably saw it as something of a nightmare. Just like you and I, when we look at the signs of our times and we see the way the world is going, some of us would easily call it a nightmare. George Carlin said the American dream is called the American dream because you'd have to be asleep to believe it. Some of us these days are having more of an American nightmare with what we see going on. And Nebuchadnezzar then comes and calls his advisors and asks them this crazy question. Now, interesting debate. And I'll let you think about it and come to your own conclusions. I have. Seldom heard in churches studying Daniel chapter 2. A debate surrounds Nebuchadnezzar here and why he asked his counselors to tell him the dream. Two schools of thought. A, he forgot the dream. That's a relevant conclusion. Honestly, I was not kidding. I will have an earth-shattering dream. Unless it's really, really dark, I usually forget about it by the time I've gotten dressed. Gone. And a lot of people suppose Nebuchadnezzar legitimately did not remember his dream. That's why he wakes up in a cold sweat, he's struggling, he's suffering, calls in his team of advisors and says, "Tell me my dream." The other school of thought says, option B, he knew the dream, but he was putting his advisors to the test to see if what they were claiming to be able to do is something they could actually do. Put their money where their mouth is. I'm inclined to lean towards that one.
I was going to say, and then also, how does he know their interpretation was actually real?
That's what I was going to say.
They were just making it up.
So, no, you're right. Put another way, how could he confirm the dream if he didn't remember it? They could have came up to him and said, "You dreamed you drank coffee with Burt Reynolds and then played a round of golf with Joe DiMaggio." And he could have said, "Sure, that's what it was." No. I think he remembered it. I do. But whether or not you believe either one of those, this much is true. This dream put Daniel and his friends in serious jeopardy. Because when Nebuchadnezzar says, "You're going to tell me this dream or you're going to die," he is going to kill, or was going to kill, all of the advisors of Babylonia. All of them. He says, if y'all can't figure this out, what's the use in keeping you anyway? And amongst that number was Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Now, presumably, they didn't get invited to this first round of questioning. They're recent graduates, remember, not long left the Babylonian Indoctrination Academy. This is where we get a serious demand. I want you to notice verse 10. Dr. Wiersbe points out that verse 10 completely obliterates all human efforts at prophesying. And he's right. So Nebuchadnezzar comes out with this serious dream, this strange dream, and we see his serious demand. He says, "Tell me the dream or else." But notice in verse 10, the Chaldeans, and remember we said Chaldeans are kind of like wise men as well as a region of southern Babylonia. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean." We can't do it. Even if we wanted to, there ain't nobody on earth can do this. And as Dr. Wiersbe pointed out, that might just as well summarize human prophecy abilities. Horoscopes, astrology, Zoroastrianism, all that stuff. Can't do it. Not with any serious degree of certainty or accuracy, if at all. And so verse 11, they continue and they say, "The thing the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." They're getting there. In verse 12, they say, "Because of this, the king was angry," or the scripture says, "he was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed." That includes Daniel. In verse 13, so the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Now, we're running short on time. And I will tell you, we're not going to get to his dream tonight. Go home and read about this statue. Daniel is going to be given the gift of interpretation from God. And Daniel's going to tell Nebuchadnezzar he dreamed of a giant statue with a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a torso and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet made of iron and clay, standing on top of the whole world. And a stone comes in, flies in, and destroys the whole thing. And it turns into a mountain that covers the whole earth. What does that mean? God knows. God's the one that sent it, and we'll talk about that next week. For what we've got left tonight, the title of our study, if you'd noticed, I put The God of Dreams and Destinies. God knew what he was doing here. And let me tell you, it is fascinating. When you look at the prophecies of Daniel and how accurate they are, it is amazing. But, we began tonight by telling you what dreams can and cannot be. Sometimes they're from God, sometimes they're not. Read Jeremiah 23. I want to spend the rest of our time, if you notice in my outline here, I think there is a picture here in Nebuchadnezzar's demands of what life is like without God. Nebuchadnezzar is in a serious pickle, for lack of a better term. And I think he is going to exemplify what life is like for people going through stressful times when they don't have God. Earlier, Andrew and I were talking about money, and we were talking about Dave Ramsey there for a minute. And Dave Ramsey always says you need to have 6 to 8 months of expenses saved up. You need to have an emergency fund. You need to have a nest egg, a rainy day fund. And he says when you do that, you take an emergency and you turn it into an inconvenience. You got to buy a new set of tires. For some people, that's an emergency. For people who are financially prepared, it's an inconvenience. I will tell you that the emergencies that people in the world deal with, for those who have the power of God in their lives, might just be like inconveniences. Because we have something that Nebuchadnezzar didn't. We have the peace of God that surpasses understanding. We have peace with God. 2 different things Paul talks about in the New Testament. But let's notice what it's like when you don't have that. I want to notice firstly, without God, there's anxiety. The Bible tells us clearly here that Nebuchadnezzar was troubled so much so his sleep left him. And why is he out of control? Why is he troubled? Personally, I think it was because he was pretty insecure. He is the king of the world's most powerful nation, and yet he's losing sleep? That's interesting. As Dr. J. Mike Menix pointed out concerning this passage, he said, quote, position does not guarantee peace. You mean to tell me people in the highest echelons of society have stress? Absolutely. You think just because you get elected to the highest office of the land, or you become a king, or you're a boss, that stress seems to leave you? No, a lot of times it gets worse. I think those of us who've had any semblance of authority in our lives and maybe been in charge of another group of people or had people beneath us can understand that those people in authority are usually more stressed. I don't think the buck private in the military has nearly the level of worry and woe as the colonel or the whoever else is higher up. I think colonel because, anyway. General, but I was thinking Marines. Highest is the commandant.
It's all the same except for the Navy.
Right.
The Navy's got to be different.
Right.
They can't just have lieutenants. They got to have ensigns.
Right. And admirals and yeah. Of course,
captains and all that.
Of course, now the Navy gets to boast, and I'll say this on camera, the Navy now gets to boast that their honorary admiral is also the Assistant Secretary of Health, who goes by she and her pronouns, but let's say was not born with she and her pronouns. He was once named Richard, now we call him Rachel.
Oh, that's convenient.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Go look up Rachel Levine. Anyway, I bring this to y'all's attention because without God, there's very much anxiety. Whether you're at the highest levels of government or at the lowliest lows of civilian life, stress abounds when you are without God. That is very clear. And those of us who have ever walked away from God can probably attest to that better than anybody. Not only is there anxiety, there's also anger. Notice verse 12 again. It says, because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. I said a moment ago he was insecure. This guy was losing his grip on control. He is at the head of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, and yet he's still kind of being a control freak. He's not getting what he wants, not getting the interpretation, and so he's anxious. He's getting angry. I mean, I've had my temper tantrums a time or two. Yesterday, I had to literally walk outside my classroom, and Ariel is trying to teach Selah, what is it? Blow out the candle, smell the flower, smell the cookie. So you don't punch something, or in this case, threaten to have all your advisors put to death. I went outside and I smelled the candle, and I blew out the candle and smelled it. Nebuchadnezzar is at a point where not only is he laying into the harm because of road rage, he literally says to these people, I'm going to have you killed. And as much as some of us would think about doing that when we're in traffic, it's at another level when you are in a position that can actually make that happen. And he's not afraid to do it. We flip over another chapter in chapter 3. He tries to have 3 little Hebrew boys roasted when he throws them in the fiery furnace, as you will see. Putting people to death was nothing for a Babylonian king. Okay? But that comes from a serious place of anger. Maybe he's afraid of losing his power. I think of Star Wars. Emperor Palpatine says when someone has gained so much power, the only thing they're afraid of is losing their power. Maybe that's what he's worried about. I don't know. And without God, these kinds of things, in my understanding, just only seem to multiply, becoming more anxious, more angry, less understanding. I want you to notice, lastly, though, that with God, there are answers. Not necessarily that you'll understand everything, but at least in this instance, there's going to be an answer found with God. God is going to be the one that comes through for Daniel and for his friends. I'm going to tease next week for you because we're short on time this evening. I want you to skip over, if you would, in Daniel chapter 2. Skip down to something like verse 16. Or rather, let's say verse 17. Daniel finds time to ask for a dispensation on that killing everybody thing. He says, give me some time. Notice in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. In other words, he asked them to do what? Pray. Pray. Fellas, we need to pray. So that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Notice in verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel. And you can go read the rest of this chapter on your own. When we come back next week, we are going to try and zero in on how Daniel and his friends are going to be supernaturally delivered. And I think this is a good place to stop because when we get to this, I don't want to skip over any of it at all. Again, I'll summarize it for you. Daniel comes in. He tells Nebuchadnezzar, I know your dream. Okay, let's hear it. He said, you dreamed you saw a giant statue, again, a head made of gold, chest and arms of silver, torso and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay, standing on the earth. And as you can see, I've kind of already told you what they mean, if you are nosy enough to read. They represent empires, world empires. First one being his, Babylon. He is going to be overthrown and overtaken. Well, he's going to die before it happens. Babylon is going to fall to Medo-Persia. Medo-Persia is going to fall to Greece under the leadership of one of the greatest generals the world has ever seen, a man that never lost a battle, Alexander the Great. Alexander's empire fragments when he dies in his early 30s, and his 4 generals take over, which is why when you get to Daniel chapter 7, there's a leopard with 4 heads, and in Daniel chapter 8, there's a ram with 4 horns. Alexander's 4 generals divided his empire eventually into 4 parts, and they were eventually overtaken by the Romans, which is what is represented by the legs of iron. The rest of it is yet to happen. The feet of iron and clay, referring to a mixed kingdom that is yet to exist just yet. And the stone that flies in and destroys it all. There's differing opinions on that. Some people think the stone that flies in and sets up a forever kingdom is the church. I don't. I'll tell you the stone is Jesus Christ. And this little thing flying in there is what you read in Revelation 19 and Zechariah 14. That is the second coming. That's when Jesus comes and reigns himself, and his kingdom is like a mountain that covers the whole earth. We'll get to that next week. It's not as complex as you would think, but I want y'all to really pray about this and study it hard, because what you're going to see in the succeeding chapters of Daniel is this theme of repetition and elaboration. When we get to chapter 7, God gives the exact same future story to Daniel. But rather than a statue with 4 different types, he shows Daniel 4 terrifying beasts. Then God gives it to him again in Daniel chapter 8 with a goat and a ram and the horns on a ram's head, or rather the goat's head, coming from the west, again representing Greece. I want y'all to understand this because this is the foundation of understanding Daniel's prophecies. There's a reason. Don McGee, in his comments on Daniel, and I know some of us have a good opinion of what Brother Don has learned about prophecy. Don's exact words, and I wrote them in my Bible, he said, Daniel is the key to understanding all Bible prophecy. And I am inclined to agree. It is history pre-written, as we'll see when we get to chapter 7. But I encourage y'all again to go home and study this because it will come up again. This is the only instance of prophecy before chapter 7, really. We're going to get to a lot of this when we pass chapter 6. But for now, understand that apart from God, I think we would wind up a bit like the king of Babylon, worried, woed, stressed, struggled, and without hope. But with one little word from God, his fears are going to be abated. You read the rest of the chapter. Daniel is going to be commended. He's going to be lauded. He's going to be given all those honors. He's going to rise through the Babylonian ranks like never before. He's going to take his 3 buddies up there with him, much in the same way Joseph is promoted to second under Pharaoh in Egypt. And it is all because of what God can do when we allow him into our lives. So think about that as we come back next week for chapter 2. Do y'all want any comments? As Brother Dale says, rebuttals? Questions? Perfect. I do appreciate y'all's attention this evening.